That's when I try killing a character, or all of them. Ooh. Author's really kicking in there. Try killing a character, or all of them. No, we're not doing that. But it's so easy. And come on, writer's block sucks. Hi guys, welcome to chapter 11 of the Castor Saga. If you're new here, we have a whole bunch of chapters before this, and I put them on a playlist for you, so go check them out. Spoiler alert, you have been warned. Chapter 11, The Forest of Poison. There was one incident with Ij and John where Ij ended up hanging upside down by a vine over a fire that he and John were working with, and that was a little scary. Tony saw what was going on and called Meli over. Meli? Melissa? We have a problem here. Meli rushed over from where she was working with Rose and Dawn, and stood beside Tony looking at Ij, as he hung upside down from a tree branch with his arms crossed. What happened? Well, we were trying a new trick, but I lost focus, and, Ij, yeah, that's right, Ij, got stuck in a tree. Now, if you wouldn't mind getting me down, please. Meli laughed and moved her hand over the fire, making it slowly dim until it was out. She looked up at Ij with a smile. Well? Hey, Tony. Yeah? How good of a shot do you think you are? Tony got a wicked grin on his face and pulled out his knife to throw it at the vine where it had crawled up the tree branch. Hey, careful with that thing. Ij looked worried. Don't worry, I'm a good shot. Tony flung the knife, flicking his wrist, and he cut the vine just above Ij's foot. Ij fell and did a kind of handstand tumble as he came up standing beside them. Thanks, guys. Sure, no problem. Gave me some target practice. Ha, ha, ha. Tony chuckled and put his hand up and made a hand motion, and his knife unjammed itself from the tree and flew back into his hand quickly. He caught it above his head, then placed it back in its sheath on his belt. Whoa. Yeah, whoa. Tony tilted his head down and smiled up at them. Thanks. Meli put a hand on his shoulder and stood on her tiptoes beside him. Tony was 6'3", and Meli was 5'9" in height, so even on her tiptoes, he was quite a bit taller than her. Someone's been practicing. I can tell. Yeah, check it out, Meli. Tony took out his knife and turned around, throwing it at a tree beside the train tracks. He hit it directly dead on center. Nice job, Tony. Thanks, but go check what I hit. Meli smiled and curiously walked over to the tree and looked around where the knife had entered the tree. Tony had pinned a fly to it by the tip of its wings. Meli was amazed by it as Tony came over, took his knife from the tree, and let the fly fall to the ground. That's amazing, Tony, but it's a shame about the fly, though. Don't forget, your knife is poisonous. The fly would have lived, though, if it wasn't. I'll bet I can fix that. It'll give me some practice at healing anyways. John came over and picked up the little fly in his hands, then took a small pinch of something from his bag. He let the sand-like dust fall upon the fly, then he blew the dust off gently. The fly suddenly flew from John's hands into the air. Meli smiled as it flew off, then she glanced over at John. Nice job, John. You realize that fly would have been dead in a couple days at most anyway, right? Yes, Tony, but it's always good to keep a balance of magic around you. Keep the good vibes, you know? Tony nodded and kind of chuckled, then looked at Meli with one eyebrow raised. John walked back over to Ij, and they began practicing again. Meli turned, looking off towards the final little mountain they'd crossed before making it to the sea and the Garden of Lily. Tony came over behind her and smiled, glancing off where she was. What you looking at, Meli? There's a storm coming, Tony, and it isn't me this time. Oh, should I keep practicing then? Meli turned facing him and smiled. Maybe. Just show me what you got. Impress me. Show me something. Tony smiled and nodded, taking a few steps back from her. Don't hold back, Tony. I want to see everything you can turn up. What if I can't control it? Well then, I'll step in if needed. Come on, don't be scared. You're in control. I know. I don't know what to show you. You've been practicing the last 3 days pretty hard. Show me something you've learned. Okay, weird. I feel like I have writer's block for magic. Is that a thing? Meli giggled and nodded. Ah, yes, the dreaded writer's block. I get that rather often, actually. But you know what helps me? Rule number 12. Writer's block for me means the future has changed and my current story no longer fits the true narrative. That's when I try killing a character, or all of them, and starting from scratch. Maybe you just need to start from scratch on whatever you show me. Try some freestyle. Don't use a specific move you've learned. You get it?
Yeah, I get it, Meli. Okay, I'll try. I've got one.
Tony took a deep breath. He put his hands out to his sides, palms down, and his eyes slowly faded into their purple color. He was seemingly pulling darkness from the shadows of the trees around him, and it was moving into his hands. Tony held what looked like a purple ball of energy in his hands as black fog erupted from his palm. Good, Tony. Good. Now what are you going to do with it? Tony smiled that mischievous grin of his and raised his hand above his head. He dropped the purple ball of black smoke on top of his head, and suddenly the smoke engulfed him as he vanished. Meli glanced around her, but was slightly worried. She turned, feeling a presence from behind her, and Tony appeared as if he'd already been standing there and grabbed her, hugging her from behind.
Boo.
Tony! Tony let go and turned facing her, laughing.
I scared you, didn't I?
I'll be honest, you really did.
Yes, it worked then.
That's a very advanced little casting you did there. How did you learn it?
I found it in the book I was given by the spirits at the beginning of the train ride.
Wonderful. Well, I see you're doing rather perfectly.
Thank you, Melissa. That means a lot to me, hearing it from you, I mean.
Meli nodded and turned to walk away, but he grabbed her hand and pulled her back towards him. He pulled her a little harder than he thought, and she kind of stumbled into him.
Whoa, Meli, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to pull you that hard. I guess I don't know my own strength.
It's all right. I'm fine. It's probably because your energy is still so focused.
Huh? How can you tell?
Your eyes, they're still purple.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Here.
He took a deep breath, and his eyes faded back out as he blinked, his eyes closed and then opened them again.
I'm really sorry if I hurt you. I didn't mean to pull you so hard.
Why did you pull me?
Oh, I was going to ask you something, but I can't even remember what it was now.
Meli giggled at his clumsiness, and he brushed his fingers through his hair as she stood there smiling at him.
What?
Meli giggled again, then smiled up at him with curious eyes. You're funny.
I'm usually more articulate than this.
Meli laughed again and pushed him by his shoulder back as he stumbled a little. Oh, I'm sorry.
What is wrong with me?
I don't know. Did I embarrass you?
Embarrass me? Oh, Meli, I don't think that's possible.
I'm sure it is. You're human after all.
Well, according to you, I'm a Castor.
You are. Meli smiled and poked his nose, then motioned over towards the fire. We should probably head back over to the fire, before it gets any darker. Tony nodded to her as she smiled at him. He bit his lip looking down at the ground, then he smiled as she took his hand and walked with him back over towards the others. They walked over and sat down while the others talked and joked around. Each was making jokes about what had happened earlier that day.
And I was just like, really, John? Really?
Everyone laughed, but Tony wasn't paying attention. Meli laid down and rested her head against the log, then slowly went off to sleep. All the girls were either asleep by now, or just about asleep. The guys, however, were still all talking and joking around without waking them. Tony just listened attentively.
So, Tony, I saw you showing Meli that new little trick of yours. How was that? And she was a little surprised. She said it's a kind of harder casting that she was surprised I taught myself. You do realize he's not talking about the trick, right?
Huh?
I'm talking about Meli. He means did you impress her with it? Oh, I don't know, maybe. She's seen a lot, so I doubt much surprises her.
How are you not getting this?
Are you secretly in the closet? Is it all an act?
Or are you really that innocent? Tony looked away from them, glancing down at Meli, kind of annoyed with them. Then finally Luke spoke up over everyone else.
Hey, lay off, guys. He's a gentleman, which is a lot more than any of you can say, so cut it out.
Luke was over by Tony resting, and he leaned over speaking quietly.
Ignore them, Tony. I get it, and I think it's really kind of you to treat her with such respect. Thank you, Luke, but what do you mean?
It's not important. Just don't listen to them. Keep doing what you're doing. You're on the right path as a Castor man to remain close to her after the trials. She cares about you too, Tony. I know. Tony nodded with a smile, then Luke laid back, going off to sleep. Tony looked around as the other guys all went off to sleep too. Tony cuddled down into his cloak and pulled it over him as the wind picked up a little. Meli was uncovered, so Tony pulled her cloak over her as well, then laid down beside her and tried to go to sleep. The next morning was different from the others. When they woke up, they were cold and pushing mountains of snow off of them. Rose and John were talking about it, and were thinking maybe it would make the forest of poison easier to bear, but Ede reminded them that the forest was probably still green, because each forest would have its own climate. They all nodded in agreement, but then they noticed something. Where were Tony and Meli? They had apparently been buried by snow that had fallen out of a tree and down onto them. Keith and Luke dug them out, but when they did, they saw that Tony and Meli were both still asleep under their cloaks. The snow had blocked the sun, making it seem to them as if it was still dark. They looked closer and saw that Tony and Meli both appeared to be frozen. Each Dawn and Jake came over and held little balls of fire in their hands, trying to heat them up. They got Meli melted enough that she opened her eyes and looked up at them. The magical cloaks they'd been given had saved their lives. Without them, hypothermia would have been imminent, but because of the magical qualities the cloaks possessed, while the outside of their bodies were frozen, their inside core temperatures were fine. They functioned like a bear in hibernation. "What are you guys doing?"
"Meli, you and Tony are frozen. Tony still won't melt. Help us."
Meli turned over and saw Tony half-thawed, his arm over her side. Meli turned facing him and leaned up, kissing his forehead. As she did, a heat erupted from her lips, and Tony melted, opening his eyes and sitting up, cracking the rest of the ice off his body, as well as off of her.
"Tony, it's okay." "What happened? Why the hell is it so cold?"
"It snowed."
How?"
Tony looked at Meli, knowing she controlled the weather, and questioned why she made it snow. She whispered back to him, not wanting the others to hear her, but they did, despite her best efforts. "It wasn't me, Tony. There must be another Castor with similar abilities close by. Maybe, perhaps, on the shadow side."
"What?"
"Huh?
What do you mean another similar Castor?
How can a shadow Castor have nature abilities?" "Well, they'd be like me. I'm a rare kind of Castor, a nature Castor, but I'm called a storm Castor. Storm Castors are originally a kind of nature Castor, however, over time, they've seemingly trained in the shadow side more and become a combination Castor instead of just a nature Castor. I guess you could call me kind of a mutation in the Castor genes. Storm Castors aren't supposed to exist, but here I am. Other kinds of Castors have done similar things."
"So then you caused this?" "No, she didn't do this. Whoever is after her did this."
"I think there's another dangerous Castor out there, and I think they want me gone."
"So you're saying there could be a shadow Castor out there who switched over to shadow from nature?"
Meli nodded, then looked at everyone else. "It doesn't matter right now. What matters right now is getting us to the Garden of Lily, where we should be safe." They all nodded and stood up, but were slightly more cautious of her, standing a little ways back. Tony walked right beside her as they all walked through the deep snow into the forest of poison. As soon as they got there, the scene changed, and there wasn't a single snowflake upon them. In fact, it was so hot in the forest that the sudden change had a strange effect on them. They were all incredibly weak at first, but then Meli stood up and raised her hands above her head. A white mist of energy left her hands and fell down upon her friends as they laid there on the tracks. They stood up, and suddenly they all had their eyes glowing brightly, and they all had that same sinister look that Meli had on her face as well. Meli smiled back at them, her eyes glowing white. "So, you want me to go first?" They nodded, and she smiled, stepping forward, walking out deeper into the forest, still remaining on the tracks. Suddenly, a vine she stepped on snatched her foot as she stepped, and pulled her off the tracks, dragging her into the forest. They were nervous for a few moments, and they heard thunder above them. They saw lightning strike somewhere out in the trees and became slightly worried. Tony called out to her, hoping that she'd answer him back. "Meli!" They heard a whistle from up ahead of them and saw Meli swing down on a vine as she landed back on the tracks. "You can leave the tracks. Just don't touch the ground." She laughed and swung from tree to tree above the tracks as they followed her, and immediately, vines began snagging their ankles, dragging them off the tracks like they had her. Tony knew the moment he was snagged that he needed to get free. He pulled his knife, slicing the vine with its sharp and poisonous blade. "Ha! Damn vine!" The vine turned to dust as Tony stood on the tree branch looking for places he could jump to follow Meli without touching the ground. The others did similar things, and eventually figured it out, but the problem was that while they escaped the plant creatures, the floor of the forest was lined with poison ivy. Ege and Dawn had both fallen, and both were laced with poison as they stumbled back to the tracks. Meli swung down onto the tracks and ran over to help them. "Nobody touch them. Dawn, we have to get you into the next forest. Otherwise, you'll probably die. What? Come on, let's go. Eej and Dawn stumbled down the tracks as the others surrounded them, protecting them from any vines or creatures that came after them. Busting into the forest of Golden Rain would be easy, because there was no gate between the two forests. They could spend the night there and be safe from harm, but the very next morning, they would need to enter the Forest of Trails, which would be hard to get through considering it was absolute randomness, where the train tracks went off several different directions. Meli and the others got Eej and Dawn through the forest and into the Forest of Golden Rain. Tony stood looking back at the forest behind them and saw a dark male figure standing in the distance. A flash of lightning zapped the figure, and it disappeared as Tony turned and followed the others into the Forest of Golden Rain. He was suspicious about the individual following them. Something didn't feel right about it. Whoever it was seemed to know more about Meli than any of them did. It made Tony uneasy, and he worried about his friend. But worrying about it wouldn't keep her safe, so all he could do was keep his guard up and try to protect her if the time came. And that concludes Chapter 11. Thank you very much for listening. If you haven't already, subscribe below, stick around for the next chapter. It'll be coming out very soon. And until next time, I love you all very much. Bye.